This class deals with the cessation of employment. This is a big topic and it's spread over 2 videos. However, the material that we cover is straightforward and should not pose a big problem. It's more a question of going across the videos, making your own notes, stopping the videos, winding it forward, winding it backwards, and making sure that you have a good set of notes at the end and are capable of taking on this as an assessment topic. So to start, employees do not stay in one job forever. All employments come to an end at some stage. It could be that people leave perhaps to get a better job, or leave because of family circumstances, or they may leave because the employer is unhappy with them. They may be dismissed from working in that organization. Or of course they may leave because they simply wish to retire and not to work anymore. So there are various reasons as to why people leave, but that process will happen to everybody at some stage. Everybody will leave work at some stage. That's inevitable. Both employers and employees can terminate a contract by providing notice. Work is voluntary. People go to work on a voluntary basis. There's nobody forcing them to go to work. They go to work to earn an income, to support themselves and support their families and to have a better life. And they may also go to work because they find work a pleasant thing to do. It occupies their mind, it interests them, they're motivated. So people may work for a variety of reasons, and these are the subjects of other videos. But the employer and the employee may back away from working at any time by simply giving notice. The employee may simply state that they wish to stop work in a month's time, let's say. Or the employer may say, we don't want you after a month. It's a voluntary arrangement. It has to be dealt with fairly. The employer just simply can't say to someone that they don't want them. They must have a reason as to why they don't want them. Now the reasons for the cessation of work, for the ending of work or the ending of employment, can be either voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary is when both parties agree amicably that the employment should finish. Perhaps the worker wants to leave to do something else. It's a voluntary arrangement. Or it could be involuntary, as I said earlier. It could be the employer wishing to terminate the contract of someone who he or she feels is not making a good contribution to work, or could even be disruptive at work. Let's look at both of these in a little more detail. We'll start with the voluntary one. So voluntary termination. Well, voluntary termination occurs when an employee, by his or her own will, decides to leave employment. So the employee decides that it's time to leave. It's time to leave to do something else, or to engage in some other activity. Now the typical reasons for this could be dissatisfaction at work. They just don't like what they're doing at the moment. Or it could be a change in personal circumstances, perhaps family circumstances. Or it could be the fact that the person doesn't like travelling to work every day. Or there can be a variety of reasons as to why this is the case. Starting a new job with a better career prospect is also a possibility. People are constantly on the lookout for better employment. The fact that they're currently in employment doesn't mean that they've stopped looking. And if a better opportunity comes along, they may wish to leave to pick up the better opportunity. And of course, employees may resign rather than being dismissed. If the employee knows that the employer is unhappy with him or her and feels that the employer is about to dismiss them, rather than being dismissed, they may decide to leave. And of course it could be retirement or ill health, another reason for leaving. So this is some of the voluntary ways in which contracts can come to an end, and some of the reasons why a contract may come to an end. Now let's look at the involuntary, or the dismissal part. Involuntary termination, in other words dismissal, occurs when an employer decides to terminate the employee's job. In this case, the employer is unhappy with the employee and wishes to end the contract, end the employment of that person. This type of dismissal is not in the hands of the employee. This type of dismissal is in the hands of the employer. The employee can't dismiss the employer. The employee hasn't got the power to do that. But the employer has got the power to dismiss the employee. The employer must be sure, or must ensure, I should say, that the dismissal is on fair grounds and with adequate reason. The employer simply can't pick on someone and say they don't like them and they don't want them anymore. That's very unfair. The person needs a job to support his or her family, to support himself or herself. And so there's a variety of reasons as to why the employer must take into account the circumstances of the individual and must take into account the reasons why he or she wishes the individual to leave. So it's a balance. They must balance the wrongdoing of the individual against this quite big step of terminating someone's employment contract. And it is a big step, because that person will no longer have an income. So it must be justified. There must be good reason as to why the employer would want to dismiss someone. Now, there are various types of dismissal that may occur. For example, there may be summary dismissal, or an end of contract dismissal, redundancy, and also constructive dismissal. Now we're going to look at each of these very briefly to get a feeling for what they are. But it's, as I said earlier, it's a big topic, so some of them will be spread on to the second video. So there will be Cessation of Employment 1 and Cessation of Employment 2. So watch out for the second video. So for the moment, let's start with summary dismissal. Now, the employer has the right to dismiss an employee without notice on the grounds of unlawful behaviour concerning their contract of employment. So the employer can dismiss someone without notice. In other words, dismiss them immediately. It's summary dismissal. It's a very serious step, just simply to say to the employee, you are finished, leave now. And that's what it amounts to. It can be based on various reasons, or it may come about because of various reasons. For example, misconduct. The person who has been dismissed may have engaged in some acts of misconduct within the company. May have operated machinery in a dangerous way against protocol and against guidelines, or may be misconducting him or herself in terms of their timekeeping, their demeanour, their relationship with other workers, their contribution to the company, and their contribution may be actually destructive. They may sort of not engage with the aims and objectives of the company. In fact, quite the opposite, try to sabotage those. So there can be various types of misconduct, all of which could lead to summary dismissal. It could be, of course, that they simply are bullies. They have bullied other members of staff, or threatened other members of staff, or verbally abused other members of staff, or customers or visitors to the company, or to the management itself. Perhaps they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol, in which case they would be dangerous on the premises. They could endanger the working conditions for others. They could make it dangerous in terms of the use of machinery, or in the stores, or simply disruptive and not the type of behaviour that the employers would want to see. They're paying for people to put a fair day's work in and contribute towards the objectives of the business and try and help the business along. That's the idea, not to turn up to work drunk. They may disregard company policy and procedures and be disobedient. Now, companies have rules. The country has rules. If we break the laws in the country, the police will investigate us, and the criminal system will be involved and may be punished if we break the rules. Well, companies have rules as well. Companies have rules about when work starts and when it finishes, and they have rules about how the work is conducted, and how the product is produced, and who's responsible for what, and how it will be laid out. So they've got all sorts of rules, and these rules must be followed. The rules have been designed with efficiency and productivity in mind, and these rules must be followed. If they're not followed, then the efficiency of the business is being threatened, and ultimately its existence has been threatened. So employees who disregard the rules do not really belong within that business. It could be neglect of duties, asking an employee to look after a machine, and they don't. They leave the machine to look after itself. It's dangerous, it's wrong, it's wasteful, and it's a dereliction of what was required. It could be the steal from the company. They steal semi-precious metals, or they steal from the office supplies, or it could be that they are stealing. Or it could be that they have regular periods when they're absent from work. For example, taking a long weekend, taking Friday as well as Saturday and Sunday off, or taking Saturday, Sunday and Monday off. So if they're absent from work on a persistent basis, 1 day or 2 days a week, it's disruptive for the company. It's disruptive for the organization of the business, and that sector where they're working will not perform well. So they may be summarily dismissed. In short, they may have some issue with the job. They don't like the job. They have poor performance. They don't apply themselves. They're not interested. They are doing it begrudgingly. They are doing the job simply because they get paid. They're not interested. They don't want to be interested. And they don't really make any positive contribution over and above the minimum that's required. So they are not good members of the team. So for summary dismissal, notice of dismissal, dependent on the seriousness of the misconduct. So the notice depends on how bad the misconduct is. If the misconduct is extremely bad, then the notice can be very short. It could be leave now. If the misconduct is not that bad, it could perhaps leave at the end of the week or leave at the end of the month. An employer's duty is to provide in writing a valid reason for the employee's dismissal and why the decision was taken. The employer really should have some evidence to back up what he or she is saying as well. It could be the testimony of other workers or of the line manager. It could be some whatever evidence that they can collect. There is a possibility that the employee will take the company to a tribunal, a legal tribunal, to seek compensation for being dismissed, in which case the company needs evidence as to why the person was dismissed. But the employer should provide a written explanation for the dismissal. Now, a second type is the end of contract dismissal. So this is at the end of a contract. This is when an employer and an employee have a contract to the employee works for a certain period. That's the contract. The contract is a one-year contract, and at the end of the year the contract lapses. Sorry, I've looked at summary dismissal earlier. Beg your pardon. End of contract. Okay. Now, all implied and expressed terms in a contract have been met by both parties. So, in this case, the employee has been hired for, let's say, a year to perform a certain task, to undertake a certain job or a certain piece of work, and at the end of the year, the job is completed, and both parties have honoured their parts of the contract. Both the employee and the employer have to give sufficient notice of termination before the employee contract can be dismissed. Well, if it's a fixed term contract, it may be assumed that it will end on the date at which was fixed at the start of the contract. So if it's a one-year contract and the contract starts on the 1st of April, it will end on the 1st of April or on the 31st of March. So, but nonetheless, there should be perhaps advice given in advance that the contract is coming to an end, just so that a reminder that the person will need to seek alternative employment. So it's based on a mutual agreement between the employer and the employee. There's an understanding that that's what happens. Fixed term contracts are quite common in the academic world. Sometimes researchers take on fixed term contracts for, say, a 3-year period or a 1-year period to research a particular topic. And at the end of that period, they will submit a report and submit their findings. And upon submission of the report, that will terminate the contract. The contract was for 1 year, they worked 1 year, and that was the end of it. Another type of end of contract, another type of cessation of employment, I should say, is redundancy. And it's one that most people will think about when they think about ending employment. They'll think about retirement perhaps, and they'll think about redundancy. Summary dismissal doesn't often come to people's minds, and as does fixed contract, it doesn't often come to most people's minds. But redundancy and retirement, these are two big areas. Now, redundancy is a type of dismissal which is based on economic factors. In this case, the business is not doing too well, the economy is turned down, so the business is not selling its product, revenues are down, so it needs to cut its cost. In other words, it needs to make some workers redundant. Redundancy is dependent on an employer who may wish to dismiss employees as the job is no longer required. So redundancy may be related to the overall sales of the business. As sales diminish, the employer want to get rid of some workers to try and cut costs and save the business. So redundancy occurs perhaps from the introduction of new technology, labour-saving machines, efficient machines which take on routine tasks and perform the tasks to a very high standard, a very close tolerance and very good quality. So perhaps it's the case that the workers simply can't compete with mechanisation. It could be, as I said as well, a downturn in the business. It can't sell. It's got very high cost structure perhaps, and it can't sell its product in the market. There are cheap imports which are competing with it. So it's a downturn, and it may lead to efforts to try and save on costs, for example, redundancies. It could also be the case that companies merge. Companies merge for a reason, and one of the reasons may be to rationalise production and rationalise their operations. In other words, make better use of their resources, including labour. So there may be some workers who are no longer needed. Perhaps they were duplicated, so they were no longer needed, and the merger means that redundancies would take place. The business may be restructured. It may be restructured totally. It may be that the product is seen as out of date, and a new innovative product is going to be introduced, or the business is going to have to relocate to a new part of the country, or to a different country perhaps, to try and save costs. So it may be looking at a total revamp of the company or relocation of the company. Any of these factors may lead to redundancies. And of course the big one is where the company is actually insolvent, where the company is bankrupt. The company can't pay its obligations, it can't meet its costs. Its revenues are less than its costs, so it must close down, leading to redundancies. There is redundancy pay associated with redundancy, and the amount of pay that the workers will receive as a consequence of redundancy depends on the length of service in the employment. The longer they serve, the more redundancy pay they will get. It will also depend on the age of the employee and on the monthly wage. So these factors determine the amount of redundancy pay that workers will receive if they are made redundant. Now, this session is one of two, as I said before, so there is a second video looking at other types of cessation of employment, end of employment. So please look at the second video and make notes from there as well. But for the meantime, I'm going to finish this one and say thank you for watching.